The Bismarck Sea, March 3, 1943. And the sun has been up for 90 minutes when Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura steps out onto the open wing of Shirayuki's bridge to look at his convoy. 16 ships are spread across the water in front of him in a formation he has drilled and re-drilled since leaving Rabaul. 8 transports riding low with cargo and men. 8 destroyers holding station on the flanks and quarters like sheepdogs. Below the decks of those transports sit roughly 6,900 soldiers of the 51st Division, packed into holds that were never designed to hold human beings, sweating in the tropical heat, waiting to be delivered to Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi at Leh, so that the Japanese position in New Guinea can be held for another season. Kimura is not a reckless man. He has calculated the risk of this crossing, the way a professional calculates everything, and his conclusion is that the convoy will take losses and arrive anyway, because that is what every convoy before this one has done. He is about to be proven wrong in a way that no officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy has any framework for understanding. The confidence on that bridge is not arrogance. It is arithmetic. For 14 months, the Americans have been throwing aircraft at Japanese shipping in these waters, and for 14 months the results have been close to negligible. B-17 come over at 20,000 feet, release their loads, and watch their bombs walk across empty ocean while the ships below simply turn. A moving destroyer at flank speed covers more distance in the time a bomb takes to fall than the bomb's own margin of error, and every Japanese captain in the theater knows it. The standing order is simple. When the high bombers appear, put the helm over, hold the turn, and count the splashes. Torpedo aircraft are more dangerous, but torpedo aircraft have to fly straight and slow and level along a predictable line, which is exactly the kind of target that concentrated anti-aircraft fire was invented to destroy. The Japanese have built their entire air defense doctrine around those two threats, and against those two threats the doctrine works. Kimura's escorts carry the proof of that thinking in their gun tubs. Between the 8 destroyers, there are dozens of 25mm mounts, banks of 13mm machine guns, and the dual-purpose 5-inch main batteries that can be elevated into a rough anti-aircraft role. The gun crews have been trained to throw up what their manuals describe as a protective canopy, a volume of fire dense enough that any aircraft trying to hold a firing solution through it will either break off or die. Commander Yasumi Doi aboard Tokitsukaze has run his gunners through the drills so many times that they can traverse and lay onto a bearing with their eyes half shut. Overhead, fighters from the 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul are supposed to be flying cover in relays, though the weather has made that promise softer than anyone would like. On paper, the convoy is protected in 3 layers. On paper, it should be enough. The cargo is what makes the risk worth taking. Leh is starving in the slow, administrative way that isolated garrisons starve, and the 51st Division is meant to reverse that. The transports carry not only riflemen, but the engineers and the artillery crews and the medical staff, along with the ammunition and rations and fuel drums that turn a garrison from a collection of hungry men into a fighting formation. Kembu Maru alone is loaded with aviation fuel and ordnance for the airfields. Nojima carries stores that the army at Leh has been requesting for 2 months in increasingly desperate signals. Every man in those holds has been told the same thing by his officers, which is that the crossing will take a few days, that American aircraft are active, and that the Navy has handled worse. Most of them believe it. Many of them have never seen the sea before and have no idea whether they should be frightened. What none of them can factor in is a workshop outside Brisbane where, over the previous 6 months, a group of American mechanics has been quietly rebuilding the concept of what a medium bomber is for. The B-25 Mitchell that rolled out of North American Aviation's plants was a conventional design, a twin-engine machine with a glass nose, a bombardier lying prone behind that glass, and a bomb bay meant to be emptied from altitude at a target that did not move. By March 1943, a number of those aircraft in the Southwest Pacific no longer have a glass nose at all. Where the bombardier used to lie, there is now solid metal, and punched through that metal are 8 round holes. Behind each hole is a Browning M2 heavy machine gun. The Japanese have no photographs of this aircraft, no intelligence summary describing it, and no tactical doctrine written to survive contact with it. The man behind the modification was Paul Irvin Gunn, universally called Pappy, a former Navy chief and airline pilot in his 40s who had been swept into the Army Air Forces in the Philippines when the war began, and whose wife and children were now interned by the Japanese in Manila. Gunn was not a designer in any formal sense. He was a mechanic with an unusual willingness to cut into an airframe first and justify it afterward, and he had already made a reputation by bolting extra guns into a 20 Havocs to give them a punch on strafing runs. When General George Kenny took command of Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific in the late summer of 1942, he inherited both gun and a problem. Kenny had run the numbers on his own bombing results and found them humiliating. Hundreds of sorties, thousands of bombs, and a strike rate against shipping that hovered somewhere close to statistical noise. He wanted a way to put explosives into the side of a ship rather than into the water near it, and he was prepared to break rules to get it. Gunn's answer began with subtraction. He stripped the bombardier station out of the B-25 nose, removed the Norden sight that was useless at 50 feet anyway, and used the recovered space and weight for guns and ammunition. The first conversions carried 4 fixed .50 calibers in the nose. Then 2 more were added in blister packs on the fuselage sides beneath the cockpit. Then 2 more, and eventually the nose itself was carrying a full battery of 8. Nothing about this was simple. Firing 8 heavy machine guns at once puts a violent, sustained recoil load into a structure that was never stressed for it, so the nose section had to be reinforced with steel plate and additional formers. Ammunition for 8 guns is heavy, and the boxes had to sit far enough aft that the aircraft's center of gravity stayed inside limits, which meant new feed chutes running forward at angles that had a tendency to jam until the geometry was worked out by trial and failure. Jack Fox, a field service representative from North American Aviation, worked alongside Gunn at Eagle Farm and made sure the modifications stayed inside the boundary of what the airframe could survive, and then quietly documented them so the factory could copy the idea later. The weapon at the heart of the design deserves to be understood properly, because the Japanese ships that met it on March 3rd were meeting a level of concentrated firepower that no aircraft in the world had previously carried in the forward arc. The Browning M2 fires a half-inch projectile weighing roughly 700 grains at around 2,900 feet per second, at a cyclic rate in the region of 800 rounds per minute. Loaded with the M8 armor-piercing incendiary round, that projectile will punch through the plating of a destroyer's superstructure, through gun shields, through boat davits and ventilators and ready-use ammunition lockers, and it will start a fire on the far side of whatever it goes through. One such gun is a serious weapon. A fighter carrying 6 of them was considered heavily armed, 8 of them mounted rigidly in a nose, and bore-sighted to converge at a point a few hundred yards ahead of the aircraft, produce something closer to a naval weapon than an aerial one, a torrent of over 100 rounds per second landing inside an area the size of a bus. Firepower alone would not have sunk ships. The second half of the innovation came from Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group, who had been Kenny's aide and who took seriously an idea that had been floating around the theater for months. If a bomb is released at very low altitude on a flat trajectory, it does not plunge. It strikes the water at a shallow angle and skips, the way a flat stone skips on a pond, and if the release point is calculated correctly, the last bounce carries it into the side of the target hull, at or just below the waterline. Fitted with a delayed fuse of 4 or 5 seconds, the bomb has time to punch through plating or come to rest against it before detonating, which puts the explosion exactly where a ship is least able to survive it. Benn's crews practiced against the rusting wreck of the merchant ship Pruth on a reef outside Port Moresby, running at it hour after hour, adjusting release altitude and range and speed until the geometry stopped being guesswork and became a set of numbers a pilot could fly. Put the two ideas together and you have an attack profile that inverts every assumption Japanese gunners had been trained on. The aircraft comes in below the horizon of most lookouts, invisible against the sea clutter, at close to 300 miles an hour. It does not need to be steady for a bomb sight, so it can jink until the final seconds. At around 1,500 yards, the pilot opens up with the nose battery, and the target ship's exposed anti-aircraft positions are inside a killing zone for the entire remainder of the approach. By the time the bomber reaches release range, the gunners who were supposed to be shooting at it are usually dead or lying flat behind whatever steel they can find. Then the bombs go into the hull from 100 yards out. The whole event, from a Japanese lookout's first sighting to the explosions, takes less time than it takes to read this sentence twice. Major Edward Larner had command of the 90th Bombardment Squadron of the 3rd Attack Group, and Larner was the man Kenny had picked to turn all of this from a workshop project into a tactic. He was young, aggressive to the edge of insubordination, and completely convinced. His squadron flew the strafer conversions until the crews could hold formation at masthead height without thinking about it, until gunners could call range by eye, until pilots stopped flinching at the moment when the target filled the windscreen. They practiced against wrecks, against towed targets, against the shadow of their own aircraft on the water. Larner drilled one point into them above everything else. You do not pull off early. The gun run and the bomb run are the same run, and breaking it means you have flown through the defenses for nothing. By late February 1943, the Allies knew a convoy was coming. Codebreakers had been reading enough Japanese traffic to establish that a major reinforcement effort for Leh was in preparation. Coast watchers on New Britain and reconnaissance flights filled in the shape of it. And Kenny had time to do something that had never been possible before, which was to plan a coordinated multi-service attack in advance rather than react to a sighting. Squadrons were briefed, rendezvous points and altitudes assigned, and the whole force rehearsed the timing over Port Moresby. Kimura's convoy sailed from Rabaul on the last night of February, hugging a weather front that promised cloud cover, and for a day the front delivered. Then it thinned. On March 2nd, B-17s found the convoy and put bombs into Kyokusei Maru, which went down with a large part of a regiment aboard, and 2 destroyers peeled off to run the survivors ahead to Leh and then hurried back. Kimura pressed on. He had no realistic alternative. Turning back meant abandoning Leh, and by the calculus he had been given, the loss of 1 transport out of 8 was an acceptable price for the crossing. That night the convoy was shadowed by aircraft that dropped flares and stayed just out of reach. By dawn on March 3rd, it had passed through the Vitiaz Strait and into the open water of the Huon Gulf, which meant it was now inside the operational radius of everything the 5th Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force could put in the air. The rendezvous over Cape Ward Hunt that morning was the largest coordinated strike the theater had ever produced. B-17 took the top level. B-25s in the conventional bombing configuration took the middle. Beaufighters of No. 30 Squadron RAAF took the bottom, and the strafers of the 90th Squadron came in behind them, so low that their propeller wash was pulling spray off the sea. The first blow was psychological, and it was delivered by the Australians. The Beaufighter is a large twin-engine aircraft with a broad wing, and from head-on, closing fast at wave height, it looks a great deal like a Beaufort, which is a torpedo bomber. Japanese captains had a drilled response to a torpedo attack, which was to turn the bow toward the aircraft and comb the tracks, reducing the target the torpedo has to hit to the narrow width of the ship. That is precisely what several of them did. The Beaufighters were carrying no torpedoes. They carried 4 20mm cannon in the belly and machine guns in the wings, and they raked the length of each ship they passed, working over the bridges and the gun tubs and the exposed crews on deck. And by turning bow on to comb torpedoes that did not exist, the Japanese captains had presented the full length of their ships broadside to the direction from which the strafers were about to arrive. While that was happening, the high bombers began their runs. Every gun in the convoy that could elevate swung upward, because that was the threat everyone understood and had rehearsed. Tracers climbed toward the B-17S lookouts called altitudes and bearings. Fire control parties worked the problem of a formation at 7,000 feet, and for perhaps 90 seconds, the entire air defense of a 16-ship convoy was pointed at the wrong part of the sky. Larner came in from the beam with 12 Mitchells behind him. What happened over the next quarter of an hour has no clean parallel in naval history. Larner took Shirayuki, the flagship, and held his run-in until he was inside 1,200 yards before he pressed the trigger on the control column. 8 guns firing together in a nose does not sound like 8 guns. Crews described it as a single continuous tearing noise that came up through the airframe into their teeth, and cordite smoke filled the cockpit so fast that pilots learned to open the side window before the run began. On the receiving end, the effect on Shirayuki was catastrophic and almost instantaneous. The bridge windows blew inward. Steel splinters and glass scoured the compartment. The 25mm mounts on the forward deck stopped firing because the men serving them were no longer alive. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds went through the ventilators and the ready lockers and started fires below the level of the deck. Larner held it for several seconds, which at that rate of fire meant close to 1,000 rounds delivered into a single destroyer, and then released his bombs at masthead height. They skipped once across the water and went into the hull. The delay fuses did what Ben's crews had proven they would do. The explosions came from inside the plating, not against it, and they opened the destroyer's flank in a way that no damage control party could contain. Shirayuki's stern separated. She was taking water into her machinery spaces within minutes, and Kimura, the admiral who had been standing on that bridge wing at dawn calculating acceptable losses, was blown into the sea and pulled out of it by another ship. He survived. Most of the men on his bridge did not. Behind Larner, the rest of the squadron was selecting targets, and the thing that struck the American crews most in their debriefs afterward was how little was shooting back. Ships that should have been throwing up a wall of fire were silent along whole sections of their decks. The strafing had not merely suppressed the anti-aircraft defense, it had removed the men who operated it, and the survivors had gone flat behind bulkheads because there is no useful human response to 100 rounds a second arriving at chest height. Transports that tried to turn found their helms unresponsive because the wheelhouse had been swept out. Oigawa Maru presented her side while attempting to maneuver and took a bomb run that broke her open at the waterline. Teiyo Maru, the largest of the transports, was hit repeatedly and burned. Ayo Maru and Shinai Maru and Taimei Maru went the same way in the same handful of minutes. Kembu Maru, loaded with aviation fuel, did not sink so much as disappear, the fuel detonating in a column that crews 2 miles away reported feeling through their airframes. The destroyer Arashio, whose captain took his ship toward the attackers in an attempt to put himself between the aircraft and the transports, was hit by concentrated fire from several Mitchells at once. Her bridge was destroyed, her steering failed, and she came around uncontrolled into Nojima and struck her. The two ships lay locked together, burning, while the attack went on around them. Tokitsukaze took bomb hits that stopped her dead. Asashio, coming back into the wreckage later in the day to take survivors aboard, was caught by a follow-up wave and sunk with the men she had just rescued. Of the 8 destroyers that had left Rabaul, 4 went down. Of the 8 transports, all 8 were gone by nightfall. Kimura had begun the day with 16 ships. He ended it with 4 damaged destroyers running for Rabaul. For the soldiers in the holds, there was almost nothing that could be called a chance. Men in full combat equipment, below the waterline in compartments with a single ladder, in a ship that opens along its side and takes on water in minutes, do not get out. The survivors who reached the surface were spread across miles of oil and floating cargo and wreckage. Over the following days, the water was worked over by Allied aircraft and PT boats, operating under orders to prevent any part of that division from reaching New Guinea, on the reasoning that troops recovered from the sea would be fighting on the Papuan front within a week. It was a decision that a number of the men who carried it out found difficult afterward and continued to find difficult for the rest of their lives, and it has been argued over by historians and lawyers ever since. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Of roughly 6,900 troops who sailed, something on the order of 1,000 reached Leh. The 51st Division was destroyed as a formation without ever landing, without ever firing at an enemy, without ever seeing the ground it was sent to defend. The cost on the Allied side was 4 aircraft and 13 men. That ratio is the part that changed everything. Navies had lost convoys before. What Japan had just lost was a category of assumption. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its entire understanding of air threat around aircraft that had to come from above or from a torpedo run. and it had built its escort doctrine, its gun layouts, its evasive maneuvers, and its training syllabus on top of that understanding. All of it had just been made worthless in 15 minutes by an aircraft that was not supposed to exist, flown at an altitude that no one had thought worth defending against, carrying a weapon fit that no design bureau in the world had proposed. Reports reaching Rabaul and then Truk and then Tokyo were fragmentary and confused, partly because the officers best placed to describe the attack were dead, and partly because the surviving descriptions sounded so implausible that they were initially treated as exaggeration. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood the implication faster than most. The problem was not that a convoy had been lost. The problem was that a heavily escorted convoy had been lost in daylight inside the range of enemy land-based aircraft, and that the escort had contributed essentially nothing to its own defense. If that was now the rule rather than the exception, then Japan could not move troops or supplies by ship anywhere within several hundred miles of an American airfield, and Japan's position in the South Pacific consisted almost entirely of garrisons that could only be sustained by ship. Within weeks, the order came down. No more large convoys to lay. No more daylight movement of transports through the Huon Gulf. Resupply of New Guinea would be attempted by submarine, by fast destroyer runs after dark, and by shallow draft barges creeping along the coastline at night and hiding under vegetation before dawn. That decision saved ships and lost the campaign. A submarine can deliver a fraction of what a freighter delivers. A destroyer running at speed in darkness has almost no cargo capacity once you have loaded her with men. Barges could carry a useful tonnage in aggregate, but they moved at walking pace, and they had to hide half of every 24 hours. And before long the strafers were hunting them too, working along the coasts at first light and catching them still short of cover. The garrison at Leh, the one this convoy had been sent to save, never received what it needed. In September 1943 it was abandoned, and the survivors walked out over the Sarawagid Range, a march through jungle and mountain that killed a great many more of them than the Australians ever did. Meanwhile, the strafer spread through the theater with the speed of an idea whose time has arrived. Kenny did not have to sell it anymore. Field modification centers in Australia and later in New Guinea developed a routine for the conversion, and what had taken Gunn weeks of improvisation came down to a matter of days per airframe. The 345th Bombardment Group, which painted its Mitchells with the markings that earned them the name Air Apaches, took the aircraft into action from the middle of 1943. The 38th Bombardment Group converted and began working harbors and anchorages. The nose armament crept upward as crews asked for more, and by the time the concept reached the production line, North American was building the strafer nose as a factory option. Late B-25J models could carry 8 guns in the nose, 4 in blister packs on the fuselage, 2 in the dorsal turret, and more in the waist and tail, which put 18 heavy machine guns on a single medium bomber. There were experiments with a 75mm cannon fitted in the nose of the B-25G and H for use against larger vessels, which worked, though most crews concluded that 8 rapid-firing guns were more useful in practice than one slow big one. The tactics scaled up as well. In August 1943, strafers went into the Japanese airfield complex at Wewak at treetop height and caught the 4th Air Army with its aircraft parked. The nose battery turned out to be as effective against aircraft on the ground as against gun tubs on a deck, and the raids over those days destroyed or wrecked well over 100 Japanese machines and gutted the air strength that had been assembled to contest New Guinea. On November 2, 1943, strafers went into Simpson Harbor at Rabaul, the anchorage that Japanese planners had treated as the anchor of the entire southern position, and swept across it at masthead height through anti-aircraft fire from ships and shore batteries simultaneously. It was one of the most costly missions the strafer squadrons ever flew, and the harbor came out of it a field of burning hulls. Japan tried to adapt. Additional light anti-aircraft mounts were welded onto every ship that could take the top weight, which helped less than anyone hoped, because the problem was never the number of guns, but the survival time of the men serving them. Some captains experimented with radical evasion, stopping engines or reversing course to spoil the attacker's solution, which worked occasionally against an inexperienced pilot, and not at all against an experienced one, since a strafer approaching at 300 miles an hour can adjust its aim in the last 2 seconds in a way a ship cannot adjust its heading. Radar-directed fire control appeared on some vessels late in the war and was genuinely useful, but by then, American numerical superiority in the air was such that the arithmetic no longer mattered. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, in an internal assessment, conceded that there was no reliable defense and recommended that surface vessels simply stay outside the operating radius of American air bases, which, as those bases moved forward, meant conceding the ocean in stages. The men who flew these missions paid for the results. Low-level attack against a defended ship is the most exposed thing a bomber crew can do, because the aircraft has to be in the enemy's most effective range and hold there voluntarily. Losses in the strafer squadrons were heavy in a way that raw mission statistics conceal, and they fell disproportionately on the crews who pressed hardest. Ed Larner, the officer who had made the tactic work over the Bismarck Sea and who had been decorated for it, was dead by the end of April 1943, killed in a crash while flying in the Papuan Theater, aged 24. There was no ceremony to it and no enemy involved. That was often how it went in that campaign. The mechanics who kept these aircraft flying rarely appear in the accounts, which is a distortion, because a strafer is a maintenance-intensive machine in an environment actively hostile to machinery. 8 guns firing in an enclosed nose deposit fouling that has to be stripped out after every mission. Feed chutes that jam during a violent pullout will take the aircraft out of the fight and possibly kill the crew, so they were cleaned and inspected by hand each time. Salt air corrodes everything. Low-altitude operation over water throws spray into the engines and loads the airframe in ways the design never anticipated, and crew chiefs worked through the night under tarpaulins with hand torches to have aircraft ready at first light. The gun harmonization alone was an exacting job, since 8 barrels bore-sighted to converge at the wrong range would spread the fire and waste it. Behind all of it sat an intelligence apparatus that made the aircraft worth its cost. Strafers could hit targets of opportunity, but the campaign-changing missions came from knowing where ships would be before they got there. Code-breaking, coast watchers living rough on Japanese-occupied islands with radio sets, and long-range reconnaissance flights fed a targeting picture that let squadrons be briefed and airborne while a convoy was still hours from its most exposed point. The Bismarck Sea was the first demonstration of what happened when good intelligence, a new weapon, and a commander willing to authorize an unorthodox plan all arrived in the same place at the same time. There is a broader lesson in the story that the Japanese naval staff drew explicitly in their post-war assessments, and it is not about machine guns. Japan's aircraft designers were not inferior. The Zero was a superb machine. Japanese torpedoes were the best in the world, and Japanese naval aviators in 1942 were as skilled as any in existence. What Japan lacked was a system that allowed a middle-aged mechanic with no design authority to cut the nose off a bomber, bolt weapons into it that no specification called for, and have a theater commander back him against the objections of the people whose job it was to say no. Guns modification violated procedure in a dozen ways. It was approved anyway because Kenny had a problem, Gun had a solution, and nobody in that chain was required to wait for permission from 10,000 miles away. The Japanese officers who wrote about this afterward identified the willingness to improvise at the point of contact as the thing they could not match, and they placed the strafer alongside radar and cryptanalysis among the developments that decided the Pacific. The idea did not stop when the war did. A heavily armed aircraft built for the delivery of sustained close-range fire against surface targets is now a permanent category in every serious Air Force, and the line runs directly from Eagle Farm through the AC-47 gunships over Vietnam to the AC-130 and to the A-10, an aircraft essentially designed around its gun in the way the strafer had been retrofitted around its. Every one of those machines rests on a proposition first proved in the Huon Gulf, which is that overwhelming forward firepower delivered at short range suppresses a defended target so completely that the attacker can then do whatever it likes to it. That was Larner's insight, drilled into his crews as one continuous run rather than 2 separate maneuvers, and it remains doctrine. For the Japanese who lived through the receiving end, The memory that recurred in accounts and interviews for decades afterward was not the bombs. Bombs were understood. What lodged in people was the sight of an aircraft coming at them from level with the sea with a solid nose and holes in it, and the moment those holes lit up. Men who had been trained to stand at their mounts and hold their fire under attack found there was no time in which to be brave, because the interval between recognizing the threat and being inside its effective range was a matter of seconds. One officer described it as being attacked by a machine gun position that flew. That is close to exactly what it was. The last strafer missions of the war were flown in the final days of August 1945 against small shipping in Japanese home waters, aircraft with 8 guns in the nose hunting vessels that were trying to slip across to Korea while their government was already broadcasting surrender. The crews came home to find it over. The aircraft they had flown were among the most improvised weapons any major power fielded in that war, assembled with sheet steel and reinforced formers by mechanics working outdoors, and they had done more to break Japan's ability to hold its ocean empire than most of the systems that had been planned in peacetime by people with budgets and drawing offices, which brings it back to a bridge wing in the Bismarck Sea at 6 in the morning on March 3, 1943, and an admiral looking at his convoy and doing arithmetic. Masatomi Kimura's calculation was correct on every input he had. His escort was strong, his formation was tight, his gunners were trained, his doctrine was sound, and his experience of American air attack was accurate. He was defeated by a variable that was not in the equation, and could not have been, because it had been invented 18 months earlier by a man in a workshop who had been told what could not be done and had gone ahead and done it anyway. 4 hours after Kimura stepped onto that bridge wing, the ocean around him was full of oil and burning steel and men, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had learned that the safest altitude for an enemy aircraft was the one it had never bothered to defend.